Okay, so
Michelle, thank you. I was just expecting caps lock.
Yeah, well,
good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. Oh, Cindy, did you start it?
I'm just checking.
Okay.
I'm sorry, before we start, we
Yep.
have to formally identify me as the Dean's representative.
Oh.
Mary C's.
Oh, I didn't read that fine print. Mary Caesar's, formerly the Dean's representative for the graduate school.
I guess we might make sure that the
And should we,
knows it. Do you know
does
Renee?
everyone,
Yeah, Renee Eisenbach, Associate Professor of Architecture.
do we need to go around and introduce everyone else or not?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Okay. So, thank you everyone for being here. I appreciate it. I know it's difficult scheduling in the summer, so I appreciate it. I'll be presenting my PhD this morning titled The Power of Synthesis, Pursuit of Environmental Sustainability and Social Equity Through Design Practice. I'll discuss the motivations for selecting this topic, the research questions, the methodology I chose, and of course the research findings. My research set out to explore how and why we design projects that put people, the planet, and economy on equal footing. And I want to start by giving some background and putting a few phrases in context, mostly development and sustainability. So we know that industrialization and urbanization were two extremely forceful elements in shaping the way we live and consume and live our lives. We know that the advent of cheap fossil fuels have really brought about a series of socio-economic trends, and they brought, so urbanization and industrialization brought unimaginable advances in healthcare, in economy and commerce and education, but if we remember Adam Smith's writing from 1776, his world had 0.8 billion people, and we now have nearly 10 times that amount. So just to kick off with sustainability, sustainability is essentially a very healthy concept. It discusses an entity's ability to sustain itself over time. So for example, in the business world, a sustainable business model is one that will allow a business to keep on going, to be here and to remain competitive. But the problem starts when profit becomes the only metric for sustainability. And the free market economy, as we know, is bent on profit and growth, and a lot of this profit and growth typically comes at the expense of the environment and society, typically both. So a sweatshop sewing factory collapses in Bangladesh, killing 1,100 people, or an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico explodes, killing tens of thousands of marine life and birds over an area the size of Oklahoma, and we just accept it as necessary evils or externalities of doing business in the 21st century. So we know that our natural systems are in dire state, and the further we go, maybe 15 years this was still debatable to a point. 5 years ago it was still debatable, but maybe more accepted. By the way, this image is a week old, this one from NASA. I don't know if you read about it. An iceberg the size of the state of Delaware broke off of Antarctica. This is a precedent by any means. So I think we should be reflecting on the values and the notions that, on our values and notions, because they really threaten our ability to keep living the way we are. And I see design as a very powerful tool to be asking what's next or what now. So I came across this article in the Harvard Business Review. It was written by two Harvard Business School professors a few years ago, called Creating Shared Value. And what they essentially say is, they coined a phrase which I love that says, all profits are not created equal. Those profits that carry a social benefit are worth more. They're better. And they make a compelling case for a new way for us to view profits in the 21st century. This is not about philanthropy. Philanthropy is the old way. Philanthropy is about redistributing wealth that's already been created. They are talking about creating new wealth by looking at our bottom line with a completely fresh set of eyes. So to take this notion to the world of planning and architecture, I introduced this exhibition at the MoMA at my defense called Small Scale Big Change. This is already 6 or 7 years old. This exhibition sort of picked out a few highlights, architectural projects all over the world that where architects and developers solved an architectural or urban need, but also carried, these projects also carried a very distinct social benefit with them. So my hope is that in 5 or 10 years, this won't be anything special. If we were sitting here 10 years ago and I was talking about high performance buildings and deep green sustainable architecture, it would have been really special. But today, it's not as much because we know how to do it. These projects are becoming more and more commonplace. There are precedents in every state, every country in the Western world. So that's my hope. Onto the research questions. My research set out to explore two very simple questions, or at least I thought they were simple. It's why we would design projects with this dual, these two values combined, the environmental and the social. How do we go about doing that? And what are any other contributing factors to these? I've been a designer professionally for the good part of 20 years. I come originally from the world of industrial and product design. I was then practicing as an architect in Europe, in Israel, in the US, and I was always trying to produce projects that are very responsible environmentally and socially. And I was frustrated by the dissonance in the market. Why aren't these taking off? Why can't we push these further? So onto the methodology. I knew from the outset that this would be a qualitative research and very inductive in nature. I looked, throughout the literature review, I couldn't find any real substantial literature addressing this dual approach consciously. So I chose a combined case study and grounded theory methodology. These two are considered very effective for tackling phenomena that are not very well documented or not yet known. By the way, grounded theory comes from the medical world or even medicine and psychology. It's essentially where you're trying to build a theory or a framework that is grounded in the data itself. So for understanding subjective issues like motivations, I found these two to be quite effective. So before I introduce the case studies, I selected 3 of them, which I'll introduce in a minute. I saw the context of each, and before I approached them, I identified key stakeholders within each of those projects. Each was in a different country. I tried to get at their motivations and impetuses for holding these values so strongly. Their design agendas and aims, very important. The process and methodology that was used in each, the role that designers undertook in each of these cases. And the 2 final points are more of an external nature. The last one has to do with any external factors like incentives or support, institutional support, what have you. And this one is about the development model, which I frankly knew nothing about. I know a little more about it now. So from the outset, I knew the design process was going to take center stage throughout my research, and I wanted to leverage my years of experience as a designer in different countries and different capacities and different areas of design to get at that. So a quick word, just for reference, the conventional design process in architecture, if we try to really even out all the differences, is really straightforward. It's very sequential, and these arrows are what would be called the waterfall effect. So no step can begin until the step before it has started. On the other hand, or actually the reverse of the conventional design process, is a more integrated process where things are not as regimented and compartmentalized, but rather thought of in a more collaborative and more transparent way. Of course, there is a trade-off. There are actually several trade-offs, but I'll get to that in the conclusions. I wanted to introduce also, or to remind you, because it's in the dissertation, this curve, it's called referred to as the McLeamy curve. Patrick McLeamy from HOK introduced this in the 80s. We all know that the further we get in the project over time, the less or the lesser or the harder it is to influence the nature of the project, and the cost, of course, of any changes will be higher as well. What McLeamy, I mean, this graph was really known and quite straightforward, but what McLeamy did is he introduced these two humps showing where the traditional design process concentrated its efforts versus the integrated design process. So if we look at this illustration, we can see on the top is the conventional design process or design schedule, and you can see that each step is really set in its own boundaries and very rigid versus the integrated design schedule where the things are much more fluid and flexible. And before we see the case studies, I wanted to share this photo, which I really love. On your left is Professor Richard Buckminster Fuller, American architect, one of the pillars of our profession. On the right is Sir Norman Foster, British architect, Pritzker Prize winner. Around Foster are his staff. And I want you to look closely at this photo because to me it epitomizes the essence of integrated design. Note how they're all engaged in deep conversation and obviously very, very much engaged. All of Foster's staff have pens in their hands, yet there's not a single line on the paper, and the ashtray is full of cigarette butts. So I think this is really emblematic of the integrated process. It's all about, it's not, I'll do my part and send it off and hand it off to the next guy down the line at the next office. It's let's sit together and try to really put our minds together and synergetically solve these wicked problems. Before we go on to the case studies, the attributes of each, which will really be important to keep in mind when we see them. So I initially chose 4 projects. One of them fell through. So the 3 projects that were researched were all of similar function, architectural program and context. All 3 were designed by architecture firms that are not fringe. They're not, these deep green, semi-hippie, pro bono, that there's anything wrong with being such a firm, but it was important for me to pick mainstream projects to show that this is not something that happens on the fringe. This is not public interest design. This is not pro bono stuff. This is something that can happen smack in the mainstream market. All 3 developers were nonprofit developers. I actually did not know this from the outset, or maybe didn't know it clearly enough. All 3 projects are formally affordable housing projects, and since they're in different countries, each one is, the fact that it's considered affordable is calculated in accordance to its surroundings. All 3 targeted a specific audience. That's also a very critical point, and all 3 were just recently completed. So the first project was very close to home. It's called The Rose. It's in downtown Minneapolis by MSR Architects. And The Rose is a mixed income housing complex. It actually took the crossroads of two major highways in downtown Minneapolis and really built, took an abandoned, dilapidated area and built an extremely welcoming and engaging project. You can see the community garden on the bottom right, which is one of their offerings to the neighborhood when it's not winter. The next project is a multi-generational apartment building in Ingolstadt, in Bavaria, the state of Bavaria in Germany. By the way, I didn't know this before, but Ingolstadt is the setting for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And I don't know if you know this, but Frankenstein is really an allegory for the way we treat nature. You know, what can happen if we keep tweaking nature and doing whatever we... So that was kind of a nice anecdote to discover. It's, again, an affordable housing complex. It was consciously and purposely designed to house both seniors and young families. It's very structured in there's a clear mix of how many seniors, over 65 in Germany. Aging is a huge issue in Germany. We're actually the first European nation to really address it formally. So you can see it's nicknamed the Atrium House. You can see the atrium on this is a rendering and this is an actual photo. So they treated the public, or the commons, the public space, in a very simple way, yet they succeed in creating something very special. Just to put this in context, the block in Ingolstadt, this is the project, but all these projects around it are also have something to do with also cater for senior audience to some point or other. These three buildings were existing, built by the same architectural firm, Danish Architekten. The final project I want to share is called Young People's Village. It's in a suburb of Oslo, Norway. The name in Norwegian is much more catchy. It's called Ungdommens Landsby, and it was completed by a young architecture firm, the youngest that I interviewed, called Haugen Zoa. Mind you, the building code for private residence in Germany is passive house. It's mandatory. So these are, to begin with, they're very progressive environmentally.
In Germany or Norway, Boaz?
I'm sorry, in Norway. So these are, they're very high performing to begin with. But even though they have a whole set of features which really render them very much high performing, very in tune with the environment, and socially as well.
I think I know what you mean by passive house, but you could just list characteristics of it.
Yes, passive house is actually a green, an ultra green building paradigm, by which a house is built with a very extremely tight envelope, extremely well insulated envelope. The windows are normally left closed and all the air intake and outtake is controlled. It's mostly used in extremely cold climates where the heating load, the energy loads are extremely high. So if I keep your house very well insulated. Normally high.
Not good in passive house, no.
So if I heat the house once and the envelope is very tight, you don't have to spend money keeping that comfort temperature.
And also there's attention paid to the orientation relative to north, south, east, west,
Yes.
where the sun is, so that you're letting in sun on
Yeah.
where you want it and protecting it where you don't. So it's also those kind of decisions. So not mechanical solutions to
Yeah.
heating it.
Or-
Yeah,
Single-
thanks for adding
fuel
that, Ronit.
solution.
So also passive solar gain, like you can see here with these windows. The reason that the roofs are oriented the way that they are is to have the southern facade. It's all glazed with PV panels. The windows are oriented in a way that the sun will heat a thermal mass that will reflect the heat back at night. So that was the final project I saw. So on to the findings. I visited the projects, interviewed over 24 professionals I thought I had a graphic here showing their spread, but I interviewed the project architects, of course, of various levels within the firm. So each firm, the lead architect and then the project architects, and then if there were any others, I interviewed them as well. The clients or developers, sometimes they're the same person, other times they're not. Any public officials that were instrumental to the process. For example, in Ingolstadt, I interviewed the mayor, the city architect, the municipal architect of Ingolstadt, and any other critical stakeholders and or consultants. So, for example, the Place project had several types of sustainability specialists or champions. Actually, all three projects did. In Norway, I spoke to a woman or the head of the organization called Future Built, which is a government-funded, I guess, non-profit, or it's a government-led or government-originated appointed organization which promotes green architecture and green building. So, after sorting through all that data, I was able to map certain elements or certain attributes or traits for all three projects. Again, putting each in context and taking into consideration the differences between them. But as an initial mapping of this is like an onion diagram of what conditions must be in place for us to even embark on this journey. Once those have been filled, what processes do we put in place to allow the project to materialize? And finally, once the process was completed correctly, what do the designers themselves, what design tools do they use to make these projects successful? And I want to show you that mapping. I mapped it across the seven stages of the design process. By the way, if we were talking about a conventional design process, the first and last probably wouldn't be on this diagram. And I'm not sure if you can see the small print, but I have points like motivators and economic incentives and performance goals and community engagement and value engineering and feedback. These are all of these were divided across the different stages of the project, and I found it very helpful to divide them to required attributes and resulting attributes. And that distinction is actually really important because if you look closely, there are some points that appear more than once, but they appear in different roles throughout different parts of the process. So for example, a sustainable design framework or a holistic sustainable design framework like Living Building Challenge in the Minnesota project or like Future Built in the Oslo Fullset project, they appear as prerequisites in the pre-design because they will really set the tone for the rest of the process, but they can appear as resulting attributes in different parts of as we get further on, because they arise from our process. So to share another illustration that I found very useful is the last question I asked in each interview. The interview was about an hour long for each. Some took a bit less, some a bit more. Some even interviewed more than once. But the last question I asked was, what was your level of involvement throughout the different stages of the process and of the design process? And I asked them to rate their level of involvement from 1 to 5, which was an interesting question because everyone said, oh, it was 5 all the way. I was like really in there. And then when I started really kind of getting in and asking, okay, give me examples and tell me what you did here and what you did here, or how many staff from your office were working at, for example, at the bidding stage. I got honest answer, or I think, as subjective as you can, but honest answers from each, and I mapped that level of involvement on a graph. There's a graph for each project, and this is actually an average of all three. Actually, also adjusted to the number of people working in each office. And if you see this hump, it really correlates with a front-ended design like we saw in an integrated process. You can also see here in this metric that the level of involvement, or the effort, the amount of effort and involvement that you put up front by all the consultants and designers, it is not just the architects and it is not just the developer or the project manager. They all had to, in a sense, put in much more effort to begin with, which is not the way a conventional design process works, in order to get the rest of the process to flow more smoothly. So if we go back to this onion diagram, I took all these points and mapped them out according to the 3 tiers of conditions, process, and design. And if you're able to see this is like the very, very essence of all of my findings from these interviews and cross-referencing answers with different professionals and judging them against the other projects. So to finish off, I'd like to share 9 takeaways or 9 findings which I thought were the essential final findings from those. So the first and foremost is motivations. So it was actually, I could spend an hour talking about each one of these, but it was really fascinating to hear not just people like designers talking about what motivates them, but even hard-nosed business people like developers and funders really described. I had the people in Minneapolis tell me, Boaz, this is all good and well, and we can all pretend that we're doing this because we're morally superior, but we're not. If this wouldn't have made sense economically, we wouldn't have done it. And yes, it took more effort. It took another 1.5 or 2 years than another project would have taken. But we think that the added value is such that it really makes sense to pursue these projects on several levels. Our image, our prestige, our attraction of new work. But yes, we also want this to be sort of go on to becoming the new norm. So motivations will lead to leader commitment. The second finding is about institutional support, and I use the word institutional quite loosely here. In some cases it was government support, like in Germany. In some cases it was municipal or regional support, like in Norway. In some cases the support was less than was expected, for example in Minnesota, or maybe took on different roles. But I felt that without the support of some higher official entity, none of these could have materialized. And that support will lead, again, to leader commitment and confidence. The third imperative, which cannot be overrated, it's somewhat of a given, maybe not in any project, but at least I should hope so, are strong relationships and acquaintance between the stakeholders. So I use the term integrated design, here and there, but an integrated design really must involve transparency, collaboration, and sharing of information, and that's not something to be taken lightly in the world of construction where your bids are really tight and everyone's competitive, and you want to make sure you have your piece of the pie. All the professionals I spoke with really, in one way or another, really conveyed this. For example, in Norway, this construction project took place with open books. So everyone could see everyone else's profit margin. So I don't know where else that happened, certainly not here in the US, but in the Minnesota project, this approach did manifest itself, but in a different way. It can all be boiled down to just a human collegial relationship and trust, which will lead, of course, to cooperation. Point number 4 is the social research and outreach efforts. The Minneapolis project did this in a very structured and very thorough way. The Germans did it because they were told, because they were obligated to do it. And the Norwegians didn't do it at all on that project. They did it in a different way. I have that listed, I have that detailed in the chapter. But without strong community outreach, without asking the people, really sitting down and holding community meetings and asking the people what they want to see built next to them, you're not getting anywhere. You know, the developer for the Fuaset project, this is a pastor in his, I think, late 70s, told me, and remember, this is the young people's village. He said, if you were living in a suburb and I told you that tomorrow they're going to build a development next to your house with 300 young people who have no money, what would you think? Like, would you want these guys to be living next to you? No way. So there were several ways which they, you know, bridge those differences, and I think that building those bridges is crucial, and it builds community trust and acceptance. Imperative number 5 of 9 is cooperation and trust between the developer and the community and the rest of the people working, collaborating on the project. Again, solid relationship and trust. Point number 6 is an appropriate design framework, and perhaps I should have spent a couple of minutes discussing the differences between the different design frameworks. I mean, we all know about LEED and maybe green globes, but the design frameworks used in these case studies or these projects are actually much more progressive and forward-thinking and much more complete and far-reaching in their approach, and also also address the social aspect of building.
Excuse me, more far-reaching than LEED, or more?
Yes, yes. So LEED is, just to answer your question, LEED is, I think, the most well-known and most well-accepted design framework in the world. It's the most, perhaps most elaborate. A lot of countries, like Israel, for example, have their own adaptation of LEED to their own locale. But LEED is seen more and more as a very prescriptive framework where you're actually, it's like a checklist where you tick off things versus a holistic framework like Living Building Challenge or Future Built, which is performative. So those are two totally different things. If I want to go on a diet, I can have one dietitian tell me, okay, this is what you eat in the morning, this is what you eat at noon, this is what you eat in the evening, versus another dietitian which will talk to me about lifestyle and, you know, a more performative, a more complete way of looking at things, understanding that each person's different, each project is different. You can't necessarily apply all the points in every context. So a holistic, sustainable design framework will lead to an integrated design process. So point number 7 is the integrated design process. I spoke about it. I won't repeat myself, but it will lead, potentially, to a building that is much better high performing, much more complete, and much more in tune with all of the aspects around it, not just energy or transportation, for example. One before last, the 2 last points have to do with the design itself, and to me, although they're last, they're by no means the least. They're actually maybe 2 of the most critical points here, is design tools, even though these took place in different contexts and countries, were used by the designers to really create a quality place for a community, not for a set of individuals, but for a community. 2 minutes. And these are really universal, almost timeless tools, like treating the open space with the same care as you would private space or personal space. It's about order and rhythm. In a lot of these urban settings, there's a great care for acoustic qualities because you want to block off the noise, and that will lead to just a better product, a better place to live for these people. The final point deals with designers and their role. And if you remember this, this was once maybe I wanted this to be the focus of my dissertation because I was just fascinated talking to all these designers saying, you know, I did not learn this in school. I did not know this before. I didn't know that I had to go out and engage people. I didn't know I had to become a facilitator. I didn't know I had to talk to all these people and really take into account you know, their wishes and their desires. I thought you know, the client told me what they want, there's a program, and we just work at it. This was a real epiphany in a way because I found some really committed individuals which were really passionate about their mission and really they really owned it. They really owned this approach. And I think that's one of the things that led to these successful projects. So to summarize, I think I was able to get at the how and the why, or the why and the how, of how these projects happen and what makes them successful. And I really hope that if we sit in this room, you know, 5 or 10 years from now, these will not be the exception, but they'll be the norm. So thank you. Before I finish, I want to thank my two advisors, Professor Marie Howland and Professor Garth Rockcastle. I experienced, you know, this mentorship as something like raising children. You know, you don't want to do the work for them. You don't want to push them too hard. You can only sort of usher them along and guide them. And if you give them enough freedom and let them trust in their own ability, they'll eventually get to good places. So thanks to my family. Thank you, my committee. So that's it.
So we were the children? Are you?
I was Yep.
At times.
All right, so we take questions broadly from the group. Just to remind you, going forward, we'll take probably no more than 30 minutes of questions, depending on how vital and vigorous they are and how willing the candidate is to receive and maintain, and et cetera. And then we need to ask the public members here gathered to excuse themselves and the committee itself deliberate. Questions, yes?
Yes, Michelle, please.
So I have two questions. One is if you could take just a few minutes and describe in one case study how these 9 come together.
Sure.
And then the second question, of course I have to go to the second question. I love your definition, reminding us of this definition of sustainability being over time.
Mm-hmm.
I am by no means an expert in affordable housing,
Mm-hmm.
but one of my main concerns, having worked in preservation and adaptive use for a long time and studied processes, it seems that affordability, usually is only a very small percentage of required units, and secondly, very difficult to ensure over time in the context of a free market economy. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question. Garth, are these okay?
Yes, these are acceptable.
Oh, you have to.
Yeah, sorry. So it's actually difficult to choose because these 9 really manifested themselves in all 3 cases. Just to be clear, I would have had maybe 15 points or a dozen or 15 points up there, but I felt they had to be narrowed down and really sum them up, sort of boil them down to the bare essentials. Plus, these projects are, they took place in such different contexts. You know, they're all people making roughly the same amount of money relative to their surroundings, but the cultures and, more importantly, the design and construction markets and cultures are completely different. I think for the Norway project, I even added a subsection about the different management models in the Norwegian construction market because it's completely different than what we know in the US. So back to your question, I'll take the Minnesota project. It's sort of closest to home and easiest to understand. So the motivation, which is point number one, really starts off with the fact that this is a non-for-profit organization. The developer is a non-profit developer. It's actually two developers, Aon and Hope Community. One is, the first, Aon, is a non-profit developer. They do affordable housing, but not only. And Hope Community is a local empowerment, education, community organization, which really took that part of Minneapolis after the crack epidemic in the 80s that really turned this area to an area which is crime-ridden and you know, half the properties on the street were abandoned just a few years ago. So their motivation is, I think it's very interesting because Hope Community is an organization that does good. This is their mission. They're you could say they're socially, morally motivated. Yet the other developer, like I said, would not have gotten into this project had they not thought it was important, but had they not been convinced that the ROI was such that it would justify it. I think from that grounding, we can see the next 3 points, which is strong connections, trust and cooperation, and outreach to the community. Because once the project was ready to get off the ground, they had already been involved with this community for, I think, something like 15 or 20 years. So they knew that this was not new to them. The next imperatives that you asked about, I think this, the minute that that both the developers and MSR architects knew that they had the Living Building Challenge design framework, this really set the table for the rest of the process. So you had a sustainable design framework, an integrated design process where everyone's on a level playing field. They sit around this table like we're sitting now. The contractor, for example, is involved in the discussion from the very outset. It's not that he gets the plans, you know, a year later when everything's been finalized and the engineering's been complete and you can't really tweak anything. So everyone is allowed to have an opinion, everyone can speak, and that's not something to be taken lightly in today's, in the way, I mean, I'm sure you know, in the realities and the dynamics of the construction world. The two final points that pertain to design, I think one of the designers, actually one of the lowest, not lowest ranking, but one of the not senior designers is actually the interior designer who worked really hard on this project. Told me, you know, to me, social equity, because I opened every interview with a short spiel about, to me, what is sustainability and what is social equity and where we should, you know, what's the context of this. She said, we put a lot of effort and money into providing the best quality interiors for these people. These are poor people. Some of them, or a small percentage, but some of them were formerly homeless or evicted at least once in their lives. They've been living in downtown Minneapolis all their lives. Half their kids have breathing problems as they are, and they're living next to a highway. Mm-hmm. So let's provide them with the best quality interiors that we can with a very expensive air quality control system, for example. And when you had to convince the developer to put the money down for that system, I think if the designers wouldn't have, or perhaps the sustainability champion as well, if they wouldn't have put their foot down and said, look, it's your decision, it costs, I don't know, $50,000 or whatever it was, but we can't wave the sustainability flag and really skimp on systems which will really affect the well-being of these people. So the designers in this case were actually advocates. I don't think it's on the slide, but they really advocated and really stood up for what they believed in, and I think that's a worthy point. Your second question, I have to, with affordable housing, I have to confess that I am no expert on affordable housing. I was not even aware that all these 3 projects were considered affordable housing when I started out. I knew the Rose was, but I had no idea how affordable housing is even categorized in Norway or Germany. And by the way, Germany is divided into states. I didn't know that either. Well, I knew, but it's not, it's not like in the US where every state has its own. But apparently Bavaria does. So, and Ingolstadt it's not a large town by any means, but it is the larger town because around it are a lot of small agrarian villages that all come to the big city. So when coming to look at affordable housing, I think all the developers I spoke with, and the 2 European developers are actually churches. They're development arms of central churches. Knowingly chose to pursue these projects because they perceive them as having a higher chance of preserving their value. And this really is going out on a limb for these residents. They said, if we show these residents that we're providing them with something better, with a good home, that's certainly better than what they had before, and it's certainly better than other alternatives in the affordable housing market, we believe that at least the majority of them will see that and will take good care of the homes. There's not going to be a high turnover. They're not going to wreck the apartments. They're going to, return that favor, so to speak. All 3 of them said this. And by the way, all 3 houses, I think one of you asked the defense, what is my category for successful projects? So all 3 of these projects have long waiting lists, all have an extremely low turnover of residents, certainly in relation to other affordable building houses projects. And I visited the projects. You see it in the residents' eyes. You see them happy to be there and proud to be living there. So I hope I answered your questions.
Maybe another piece of it, though, is what policies are put in place or what guidelines that keep these units available for the types of people that they were intended for.
Okay, so.
And that's part of the question of sort of the long term.
Okay, so I did look into this, but I didn't, this was not the focus of my research. I spoke to all 3 developers, some of them even, with several of the projects, even to more than one. Actually, with all 3, I spoke to more than one. And they all have, affordable housing, it's at least in part government funded, so they have to adhere to the government guidelines in terms of relation to median income, number of children, your age. So because I knew that these were sort of branching off formal government policies, I didn't even look into it any further.
So the point is, I think, to add Sir Michel's question, is part of what's put in place for their continuity is the set of guidelines that are in perpetuity.
I didn't know that's what you asked.
The
Yeah, of
regulations.
course.
And
Yes.
regulations.
Yeah.
They can't be solely market
Terms and
rate
con-
after 5
No.
years.
Terms and conditions for the
Right.
funding.
No.
That
Otherwise, they actually, I think in Minnesota, it's in effect for 20 years. After that, they're allowed to offer a percentage
Yeah.
at market rates.
Okay.
Participation of the tenants in the planning. Did you see differences in 3 cases? And to what degree? That seemed like that would factor into this question about the
Okay.
sustainability of the.
Yeah, sure. That was also at one point a good candidate for the focus of my dissertation, is how to go about participating, or how participatory design or participatory planning happens with regard to sustainable projects. So yeah, there were huge differences. And it's actually, I'm smiling because it really illustrates the difference between the mentalities of the 3 countries I was in. So the Germans were all extremely proper and strict, and there were community participatory sessions, and there was a public exhibition, and they even had a series of like people knocking on doors with a tag and explaining to the residents what was going to be built and getting their feedback. But it was all very closed off and they only asked them a certain set of questions, took it all into account. I think the city architect of Ingolstadt elaborated on that, put them in a big Excel sheet and distributed it to the planners, because this is not just one project, this is actually 3 others. Norway was really European, kind of almost Dutch, really free and flowing, and anyone who had anything to say was welcome to say it. They had, I'm sorry, I don't have a screenshot of that. They put up a website for the project, and they invited anyone in a 20-mile radius to go in and post their comments online, and they showed the renderings, and they took the website was taken down, but it was great to see it, because it was almost like an open chat room, and some people were really not aggressive, but really opposed to it. I think it was something like 15 to 20% of the people commenting. All the others were only asking what it can do for them, and were generally positive. And I didn't say it in the presentation, because you can't say everything, but in the case study of the Forset project, they built another structure on the site, which is a bicycle workshop. In Norway and Oslo in particular, people bike about 8 or 9 months out of the year, even in winter. So everyone has 2 or 3 bicycles. The one crappy bike that you commute with to the city and you don't care if someone steals it, the good bike you ride on weekends, and the family bike that you take your kids to activities or go shopping with. So they have 2 parking spaces that they allocated to the Oslo carpool project. They have this bicycle workshop, and they have a great common area. And all this was on the website, and people were really excited and started, saying, "Oh, can you open, south? Can you do this? Can we add a garden? Can we add this? Can we add that?" And it was very much open, and everyone. It wasn't structured, is what I'm trying to say. And the American project in Minnesota, it was a very well thought out, very elaborate process. They had a series of workshops called A New Shade of Green. They partnered with several bodies outside of, apart from the developer and the architect, like University of Minnesota, the local AIA chapter, and they had these open community meetings where everyone was able to participate. They even built a set that was nicknamed the Pizza Box, where they had tiny little houses made of wood and trees and roads, and you could come and set it, and people could physically touch and see how this complex was going to affect that street corner. So it was, to answer your question, it was just fascinating to see it, that each of them saw the importance of that outreach, but each of them did it a completely different way.
Hey, Boaz, I really enjoyed reading
Thank you.
the dissertation. It was really provocative to me. So I have a couple of questions. A couple of pragmatic, just trying to understand how are fees structured differently if you're moving the weight of effort towards the beginning of the project.
Wow.
But I think the bigger question that I have is one about ideology. And at the very end of your dissertation, you talk about the topics that could be in the future.
Sure.
So 2 pieces about
Yep.
that. One is, and I know you said it's a future topic, right? But, okay, so you're looking at these mashups between environmentally sustainable project and social equity.
Socially
Sustainable and
equitable, yeah.
social, and for social equitable, kind of factors, right? And so, my question is, the merging of these 2 things, right? That's part of what you were looking, you
Sure,
chose the
of course.
project. What were the what were the influence of one upon the other? What does it mean to put these things together in terms of value added? How did that shift the arguments for this kind of project and for its long-term sustainability? And then the other piece of that question has to do with using the word progressive. And I think that's a bit of a problematic word, and especially if it's something that you can talk about kind of principles we agree on in terms of architecture, rhythm, that are human, that are universal principles, right? When you say, well, part of what's in place here is a kind of progressive attitude towards society and towards the role that architects and design play in the creation of healthy and social environments and a sense of social justice, right?
Sure.
So those things needed to be in play also, and in some cases, in all of the cases, you said we needed to have the table set in a certain way, the soil set in a certain way. And on one hand, you say, well, these are architects who are mainstream architects, yet every one of the developers was not a mainstream developer.
Right.
They were also not-for-profit developers, right? And so, the question also goes to a question about ideology. I recently had the chance to visit Belgrade and saw the housing that Tito built, right? Social housing, amazing social housing. But as the government shifted, right, there's no support anymore for that housing. So what's interesting, and for that whole vision of society. So what's interesting to me in your project is the question of, can this kind of project and vision be more mainstream? Can it happen in a conservative town like the one I lived in Michigan, which adopted recycling because financially it made sense for them, right? And so can it happen in a place where we're not looking at not-for-profit developers, but we're looking at for-profit developers? Sure. And if so, because until that happens, I don't see how this becomes more widespread. So that's my
Great questions.
And these are
Okay, so
big questions.
yeah, big questions. I showed Buckminster Fuller earlier, but one of his better-known quotes is, "You can't change the system by forcing people or even convincing people that the alternative will be better for them. You have to demonstrate that alternative as more lucrative and maybe financially is a part of being more lucrative, and letting everyone follow because it makes sense to them." In other words, I don't want people to do this because it's the right thing to do. I mean, I do, but it's never going to happen. I want them to do it because they realize there's no other way. And I personally think that in a few years from now, I see the market going there. And this can be, I'm going to shift away for a minute from the housing market. You see with the millennials and the younger what we call the Y generation, there is there's a growing distrust in anything institutional, anything government, anything very old world, very regimented, because in the age of social media, you can't hide these injustices anymore. I think the developers that will be the first to offer added value, this is not about them going all for, becoming nonprofit, but you must offer an added value to your residents. The added value can be a better product, it can be a more affordable product, it can be a product that looks beyond what we now see as a housing development. And I think all three of these, yes, they're nonprofit developers, but they still have to, they at least compete. They compete for funding and they compete for grants, and they still have to compete against other similar developers in the market. So to your question about ideology, I think that despite what I just said, all three of these, yes, it did make financial sense, and yes, they did their homework with the numbers And with the ROI, the Minnesota project even was on hold for, I think, 1 or 2 years because they ran out of funding and they knew they wouldn't have been able to complete it to that quality standard that they set out for. So they just froze the project until those funds were secured. But they all had almost not a passion, but a strong motivation for knowing that they're doing the right thing. And if they want to do it because it paints them in better light, if it reflects well on them, so be it. But so I don't know if I answered your question or not, but it is, I think it's a mix of both a moral incentive and other more earthly, logical incentives that make sense. And by the way, the Rose, the Minneapolis project, was highlighted by the ULI, the Urban Land Institute. They performed an extensive case study on it, published it about a year ago, to show that this is possible. This is the first affordable housing project in the nation that's built to such high environmental standard. And they really wanted to see this as the head scout, running before the.
That addresses the environmental standard, right? It's the social equity piece that's the lagger, right, in terms of how you make the argument for it. That's not just because you morally think it's better or you're liberal or whatever. So we've been getting to the point where you can show that creating a building that has a higher performance, there's payoffs and financial payoffs. I think
Okay,
it's.
I understand. I understand. I'm going to go out on a limb here. So I spent
okay,
I spent about 3 weeks in Europe. Okay, looking, or less, but I don't know how much we're aware of this, but there is a huge geopolitical shift in the Middle East and Europe as a result. I think these social problems, pardon my French, are going to bite us all in the ass if we don't address them and really attune our attitudes or shift our attitudes to prepare or to become. I mean, we can't be as complacent as we have been for the past few decades. In Israel, which is where I come from, these manifest, I mean, we don't have much of a refugee problem because Israel is very, has tight borders with security, but we have another problem, which is affordability of housing. 80% of young couples can't put together a down payment to buy a place of their own. So I think these.
I want to keep moving the questions, and I think one of the things I want to, if I can contribute a little bit to your thinking, and you may or may not know this part of it, but two of the major motivations for the professionals involved and the developers involved to go after the social goods is that there is no, it's actually there is a waiting list. Both the developer and the architects now are flooded with inquiries because the administrative
Sorry, I knew this. I
agencies
should have said
have approved their projects more easily and efficiently, so that's one of their front-end benefits. They actually get their approvals more quickly, and there's a waiting list of tenants that want to get in because the reputation is that they have successfully delivered to their stakeholders. And the stakeholders have created the buzz.
So it's post facto, so you're
Yes.
saying that
That's
that's part of the dropping the
That's
stone
like
in the
a
water.
financial benefit, it
Mhm.
comes back through interest and desire. I want to make sure other committee members get a chance to ask questions or.
I have a couple. So I really enjoyed this, and
Thank you.
I just wanted to give you kudos for really centering on environmental sustainability together with social equity considerations. So I'm in American Studies, and we're a pretty radical, pro-social justice enterprise these days. So I wanted to pick on your methodology. And so this is coming from the angle of critique, respectful critique. what I'm interested in is how you got data on how well these projects are working. And when I look, you sort of talk about your theory building as a bottom-up approach. So the specifics of data produce the generalizations of theory.
Mm-hmm.
In American studies, we would use the term bottom-up to focus on a bottom-up approach of really focusing on the people at the bottom of the social pyramid and trying to get a sense of how they're experiencing the phenomenon we're studying.
Mhm.
Okay, so two kinds of bottom-up.
Sure.
My sense when you got down to the interviews is that you interviewed stakeholders who were top-down. You didn't really interview bottom-up. And so I was interested in pushing you a little bit on how well you know how these places are working from the standpoint of the people who are living there, who are actually experiencing them. So, just to give you a contrast, I'm working with a PhD student in American Studies who's studying a Hope 6 housing project in Baltimore, which has about 25% Section 8 housing units in an otherwise market complex. And he's probably done, I would say, 75 interviews, in some cases going back 2 and 3 times. So spending a few hours with the affordable housing, subsidized housing tenants to get a sense of how the place is working.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, that's a really bottom-up kind of, heavy duty, really trying to understand how these places are working from the standpoints of the people who are being integrated into this market, housing or not maybe being the effective word in this particular case for Bob Shoplett's dissertation. But, so I just wanted to get a sense of, how confident are you that the people you interviewed really have an understanding of how well these places are working for the tenants?
So, your question's legitimate. It's something I was asking myself throughout, and I at some point I considered, taking longer to do this, but sort of widening the spectrum of interviewees. I have 2 answers. One is, as an architect, or as at least a practicing architect, not a licensed architect, I think the professional experience that I've had over the past few years has really allowed me to come into a project and evaluate it through the eyes. It's not the first project I walk into, and it's not. I mean, in this room, it's only Ronita and Garth who are architects, so it's.
Michelle?
Oh, I'm sorry, Michelle too.
And Steve?
But
Yes.
so, I'm sorry.
Okay,
So
on the
we're
committee.
the majority. We're the majority. It's good.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say, Dr. Sees, is I don't think, or I think that my experience as a designer, I try to leverage it to get at those bottom-up insights that you're talking about. Because you can walk into a place during daylight hours and see if it's convivial and if it works well. And you don't have to, sure, you can argue that I should have interviewed tenants. At some point, I considered interviewing the heads of the tenant association because each project has one. But I have to say, all 3 projects, yes, all 3 projects, I was not the first one to come in and study them. Because all 3 are unique and are groundbreaking in a sense. So to question the residents would have required a completely different process, and I think it would have shifted the focus of my research. I knew from the outset that I wanted to look at the design process. This is a design dissertation. I'm sure that had I interviewed tenants, I would have gotten some other insights, but I feel confident enough that talking to the array of people that I have in each project, asking the same questions and crossing them with each other, and seeing the projects in person, visiting the sites and walking them and talk. All these architects, they don't just walk away from the projects after they're finished. They're still involved and they visit, and every time there's a problem, even a mechanical issue, they will go out with an engineer and see what the problem was to learn from it. So I take your criticism, but I think with those two combined, I think I have that covered. And your bottom-up comment is, I think it applies here. But again, I think this served its purpose.
I think context is really key in these issues. I can't speak to the European projects, but I've done a lot of research focusing on housing that is affordable housing that is being created for people where there's a society with a strong racial divide.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I have learned from doing that work is that as a white person, I cannot assume that I really understand what it is like to experience a different environment in a racially difficult, tense set of circumstances. I've learned that over and over again, so I just want to push back a little bit and caution you about how much you're understanding. I mean, we look at so many community opportunities for feedback that are set up disingenuously, like meetings set up during the day when working people really cannot attend without losing money. They're not in the sort of situation where they can't attend without losing money, and they can't afford to lose their
Sure.
job. So there's just such a long history of these kinds of disingenuous efforts to get community feedback in this country. That I just want to caution you. But I wanted to move on to a totally different question. I wanted to push you a little bit on where are you on fourth pillar arguments. My own experience, and this comes from going to the sustainability conference that that moves around internationally every year, that focuses on all four pillars of sustainability, and has an extremely robust section of people doing cultural research. So I wanted to push you a little bit on, it seems to me that you acknowledge cultural issues, but you mash them together with social. And my experience is that that kind of position is most characteristic of scholars in the United States, and that scholars, particularly in the Pacific Rim, tend to take the fourth pillar of culture very, very seriously, and make these dual arguments that come on some level. Housing and architecture is extremely cultural phenomenon, but also that we're talking ultimately, when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about changing people's behaviors and values. And on some level that has to be addressed culturally, otherwise it won't happen. So I just wanted to see where you were on that issue.
That's a great point, Dr. Sees. I have an answer. So just to put this in context, the Rose Project in Minnesota houses predominantly the Somali immigrant community. The one in Furuset in Norway has a majority of Pakistani, not refugees, but immigrants, mostly second generation. And the one in Germany has sort of a mix. I think the largest minority there would be Turkish. The Germans had a very large Turkish immigration after the Second World War to rebuild the country. So I think to answer that, this is a point that actually did come up in the interviews, but my answer to that would be all these communities, there's a tension of keeping your own cultural identity versus assimilating into the country you're in, and most of the people I saw. Even the Ingolstadt project, which has about a 30% senior population, they all see themselves as, I can't think of a good, it's not citizens of the place, but they will speak their native language at home, but they will try to assimilate in the local culture when they're outside. And it's like my comment about the mentorship. I think our job as architects is to provide the best surroundings or the most fertile ground for these people to flourish and to, if they want to retain their own cultural identity, then we should, respect that and allow them to do it. I think at the very basic level, all these residents need the same things. They need a good quality place to live, they need accessible transport, they need employment, they need access to, a supermarket and a kindergarten for their kids. So that's, this point did come up, but I purposely did not see this as a focus.
In some ways, I think when we're talking about bigger picture sustainability issues, looking down the next 20 to 50 years, where it's going to be really crucial what we do.
I think it was crucial what we did
Yeah.
10 years ago, but
I
please
think
go
that,
on.
the cultural issues are not directed at people in subcultures. They're directed at mainstreams in any culture, the people in power. How do we get mega consumers to change their values and change their behaviors so they are not maintaining a non-sustainable lifestyle? They're not using up too many. And to me, the argument I'm making, and so this is a pitch for you to, maybe come around and think about it from a different angle, is that we have to address those issues partly culturally. Your identity, issues of how you have been socialized to create the trappings of your life are very deep and they're ultimately
Yes.
cultural. But we have to change them. We have to find a way to change them somehow, because otherwise we're going to run out of resources and have to go to Mars. And that's a big project. So, I'm saying this lightly, but I think it's a very, very serious issue. And I think the cultural component tends to be discounted. And I think, as you know, the social equity component tends to be discounted
Yes.
as well. Both of those things, in my way of thinking, really need to be centered. And I applaud your work for centering the social equity part of this. It's a very important pillar, but I think the cultural pillar is an important
Okay.
one as well.
Thank you.
Jim, did you have?
Yeah, you've got 3 case studies, one US, 2 European ones, and I'm wondering what you see in terms of the political, financial, social differences in terms of the support that would be available to expand these examples that you've got here. In other words, I have this maybe bias that I think it's probably more likely that we would see in European cases more financial support, more political support, and then the social aspect of it in terms of what will the neighbors allow is an issue. So I'm wondering, based on what you saw in those 3 countries, if you see differences in those.
I did. Before I answer, I want to expand on that last remark you made. Even the people's relationship with the public space, the commons, in Europe is completely different than what we're used to in the U.S., at least post-war. I think maybe in the 40s it was different, the 30s it was different. People's attitude to the distinction between their private space, the semi-public space, which is your courtyard, and the completely public space, which is the street and on, is completely different than what we see here. And that was a fascinating thing to see. With regard to institutional support, I have to say that I did dig deep within those 3 projects, but I don't feel I can comment, I can't generalize from these 3 case studies. So yes, I'm inclined to say that in Europe, particularly in Germany, your institutional help will be much greater, and there are many more programs. By the way, the sustainability framework they used is not even an international one or even a national one. It was called E%. It's a specific Bavarian energy-centered sustainability framework, which they used because it gave them the most incentives, and it was a good one. But you could argue that the Germans are so focused inwards that this project could only happen there. So trying to generalize, yeah, I did feel that in Europe, not only in these two cases, because I looked at other candidates, I looked at a project in Spain, looked at a project in Greece, I looked at a project in Israel, I looked at a project in Sweden, one in London, which almost materialized but then fell through, London, England. So yeah, there is a sense that things are less bureaucratic, maybe less red tape. As an outsider living in the US for the past 4 years, I still can't get my head around the different regulations in the different states. Because what do you do when your energy comes from Texas to a broker in Virginia and then to your home through Pepco, which is a local distributor? How do you even build an energy strategy when, and all these projects start out by building an energy strategy when things are so centralized yet spread out over larger distances with different tax regulations and incentives. So,
So we're gonna need to break in about 5 minutes in order to have the committee deliberate a bit. And so I wanted to invite any other visitors to offer questions or comments. Hearing none, Maria, I want to, no, you're okay?
I'm good, yeah, I mean,
Okay.
we've had
I
time
have a
to
quick
discuss this,
question.
yeah.
Please.
So we talked about at the end of, what these projects would maybe invite in the future.
Sure.
I'm curious, and this is outside of the scope of your dissertation, so we can continue this question later. But what implications does this work have in your mind for how we teach future architects?
Oh, wow. That's the chapter I didn't write, Renee. It just got too long, I'm sorry. I'm not joking. This was something that came across very strongly, especially with the American office. I think I interviewed the most architects there too. But they're all involved, at least the senior ones, they're all involved in higher education like Garth is. They're all, senior, seasoned architects, and they have this distance that I think they can see things maybe more clearly. I think that when I was a design student in the 1990s, industrial design, mind you, this was the high-tech bubble, and we were just taught to design things really well to sell a large amount of units of, and to make as much money for the companies who would employ us. And no one talked to us about other aspects. I'm not even talking about green manufacturing or design for disassembly or life cycle assessment or cradle to cradle, none of that stuff. And yet here we are, and 20 years later, and this is the topic of my dissertation. I think that today these topics, Jen teaches a course, half the people in this room teach courses about sustainability in one way or
really expand
another.
that question to the students in our school,
Mhm.
because you're also talking about cross-disciplinary work, right?
Mhm.
So.
I don't have to, well.
It's a fertile question.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I think this is probably a yes or no question, but one of my takeaways from this is that this is never gonna happen without government involvement or private
Yes.
sector, or sorry.
Or
church.
private
Yeah.
sector, yeah.
Church kind of institutional, it's not gonna happen.
Unless it's like Tito in Yugoslavia,
Yeah, but
Right,
we're,
where
yes,
it's just-
but fortunately,
which
we're
is
not there.
government,
We're not there
in
yet.
effect. We don't want to be there.
Yeah.
Just to also jump in, Donovan Rickama, a guy who's an economist who teaches at Penn, expert in historic preservation,
Mhm.
economics, he made a fantastic case 10, 15 years ago already about why existing inner cities are by nature can be sustainable, and one of the points is that you have to have affordable housing, right, within walking distance to make an elite or corporate center or government center sustainable, because you need workers at different
Sure.
ranks, right? So when you don't have that, you increase commuting time from lower income areas like we have in DC.
Mhm.
from Wheaton and beyond into the inner city. So what you've saved in carbon footprint on site,
Yes.
you waste in terms of fossil fuels from commuting. So I think those kind of arguments can be used to create a public policy imperative. Why you need mixed incomes, not only because we like mixed incomes or we want to be good to poor people, but because it's actually necessary to sustain an economy and reduce fossil fuel consumption, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and just to add, the ecological argument for that would be that an ecological system has to be diverse. It must be by its very
Right.
nature.
Right.
It has to be built of differently, different tiers and different levels. And just like in nature, you can't only have the carnivores without the herbivores. You have to.
Right.
Sorry for the
Right.
analogy, but
Right,
you have
right,
you
you
have
have
you have to have
diversity of
a
incomes.
good diverse mix.
Yeah. I think, although that wouldn't be the sweetest note to add on the carnivores and herbivores, I think we do need to.
Well, maybe yes to Marie's question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Garth, let me just interject for a second, what Renee brought up, which must come out of your dissertation writing, the issue about progressivism, and I don't know where I read it, but just over the weekend, this might be somehow helpful. It must have been a book review or something that I read that had to do with perhaps a book on sort of the history of what progressivism is, what the movement's been. And the basic synoptic little sentence that I can't paraphrase very well, but out of that, it was basically it was a reaction to the very conservative culture of Europe, sort of pre-industrial revolution. That the industrial revolution generates all these tensions and changes and stuff, which you're addressing in one form or another, and the fundamental idea of progressivism had to do with the kind of recognition that those things are inevitable in a capitalist technological society with unforeseen circumstances